The word on the screen right now is temple. You've seen it 1,000 times. You've probably said it out loud without thinking, in a sermon, in a prayer, in a conversation about where your faith actually lives. You picture stone, columns, a sacred building set apart from the noise of ordinary life, a place you enter to encounter the divine and then exit back into the world. That picture is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. And the part that is missing changes everything about what the Hebrew writers thought they were saying when they reached for this word. The Hebrew is Hekal, Hekal, spelled with 4 letters, He, Yod, Kaf, Lamed. It appears in your Old Testament 80 times, in Samuel, in Kings, in Chronicles, in Psalms, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, in Jonah, in Micah, in Nahum. 80 occurrences. And 70 of those 80 times, your English Bible renders it temple, the sacred building, the religious category, the place God lives in while you live somewhere else. But the other 10? The other 10 get translated as palace, the residential and administrative compound of a reigning earthly king. Not a house of God, not a religious institution, the seat of royal power and the living quarters of a sovereign. That is not a translation anomaly. That is not a quirk or an oversight. That is the definition. Pause here and let the arithmetic sink in. 70 times temple, 10 times palace. Same 4 Hebrew letters both times. The lexicons do not give you 2 different words that happen to look alike. They give you 1 word with 1 consistent meaning, and 2 different English translations that reveal a decision the translators were making, not a distinction that exists in the Hebrew. The word never changed. The translators changed it for you based on their judgment about which English category fit the context. And that judgment, made thousands of times across hundreds of years of biblical translation, quietly rewired how you think about what the writers actually meant. To understand how deep this runs, you have to go back further than Hebrew. The word Hekal is a loan. It did not originate on Israelite soil. Scholars of the ancient Near East trace its etymology through a well-documented linguistic chain that spans millennia and crosses 3 civilizations. Biblical Hebrew Hekal derives from the Akkadian ekallu, the word used in the cuneiform texts of Babylon and Assyria to describe the royal complex of the king: palace, great house, seat of sovereignty. Every time a scribe in Nineveh pressed cuneiform signs into a clay tablet and wrote ekallu, they were describing where the supreme human authority lived, administered justice, received tribute, and conducted the total business of governance. And the Akkadian ekallu is itself borrowed from something older. It comes from the Sumerian compound egal, 2 syllables from a language that predates both Akkadian and Hebrew by centuries. Means house. Gal means great. The egal was the central structure of Sumerian city-state power, not simply where the king slept, but the entire operational and residential complex of the sovereign. Treasury, administrative offices, storehouses, audience chambers, domestic quarters, scribal schools, all under one architectural logic. Everything that made the king a king happened inside the egal. That compound became ekallu in Akkadian, traveled across the ancient Near Eastern world through Ugaritic and Phoenician correspondence, and arrived in biblical Hebrew as Hekal, carrying every layer of that royal history with it. The Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon, the most authoritative reference tool in academic Old Testament study, lists the primary definition as palace, temple. Palace first, because that is the word's oldest and most foundational register. And there is a technical detail that almost every word study on Hekal omits. When Hekal appears specifically in the architecture of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings chapter 6, it names a particular section of the building, not the whole structure, just one specific hall. The Israelite temple was divided into 2 main chambers. The inner room was the Debir, the Holy of Holies, the most restricted space in the known world, where only the high priest could enter once a year. And then the outer chamber, the main hall between the Debir and the entrance. That larger space was specifically called the Hekal, the Great Hall. In the architectural language of the ancient world, the Hekal was the room that immediately preceded the sovereign's innermost chambers. It was the hall of approach, the room where proximity to power was palpable, but direct access was still regulated. Before we go to the specific passages in the biblical text, there is a dimension of Hekal that almost never gets mentioned in these studies. The word does not only describe buildings on earth. Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 20, "But the Lord is in his holy Hekal, let all the earth keep silence before him." And Psalm 11 verse 4, "The Lord is in his holy Hekal. The Lord's throne is in heaven. These passages are not describing the building in Jerusalem. They are describing a cosmic reality of which the Jerusalem building was a deliberate earthly copy. The ancient Near Eastern template for the Hekal was always hierarchical. The earthly palace of the king reflected and derived from the heavenly palace of the divine king. Israel's writers took that template and pressed it to its logical conclusion. YHWH's Hekal is the heavenly original. The Jerusalem building was not the source. It was an architectural echo of something that predates every stone ever quarried. Let all the earth keep silence before him. That line from Habakkuk is not poetry. It is protocol. The ancient world had specific protocol for approaching the royal Hekal. You did not enter speaking. You did not arrive with demands. You waited. You were silent until the sovereign spoke. Habakkuk's line assumes exactly that logic and applies it at cosmic scale. Now let me show you where all of this lives in your actual Bible, because you should not have to take my word for it. The text itself makes the case. Open 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 1. A man named Naboth owns a vineyard, and that vineyard is located next to the Hekal of Ahab, king of Samaria. Your English Bible translates it palace. Ahab is not a holy man. He is, by the account of the king's narrative, one of the most flagrantly corrupt rulers in Israel's recorded history. A man who married Jezebel, introduced organized Baal worship at a state level, and who would, in the very episode that mentions his Hekal, use the machinery of his sovereignty to have an innocent man executed so he could seize his land. What makes that passage devastating once you see the word is the contrast it creates. Naboth refuses to sell on covenant grounds. The land is his family's inheritance from YHWH, not transferable at the pleasure of a human king. Jezebel manufactures a legal execution, and then YHWH sends Elijah directly to the site of the crime, to the vineyard next to the Hekal, and delivers a verdict. In the very place where you murdered, the dogs will lick your blood. The Hekal of Ahab and the covenant authority of YHWH face each other in that scene, and the text leaves no ambiguity about which sovereignty actually rules. The king's Hekal did not protect him. It documented his crime. 2 Hekals in tension, and only one of them holds ultimate authority. Go next to Nahum chapter 2, verse 6. The prophet is describing the collapse of Nineveh, the imperial capital of Assyria, the empire that had deported the northern kingdom of Israel and scattered her population across foreign territories for generations. Nahum writes that the Hekal melts, dissolves, collapses. Your English Bible translates it palace, the administrative seat of the most powerful imperial organization in that era. Then Isaiah chapter 13, verse 22, the prophet's vision of Babylon's coming destruction. Isaiah describes wild creatures howling in the Hekale One-Egg, the pleasant palaces, the luxury compounds of the Babylonian ruling class. 3 different powers, 3 different kings, and every time the translators write palace, because in every case the building belongs to a human sovereign. But point the word at God, and it becomes temple. I want you to stand at the entrance of the great Hekal of Sargon II at Khorsabad, 12 miles north of ancient Nineveh. Archaeologists excavated it in the 19th century. The complex covered 25 acres, walls between 9 and 16 feet thick. At the entrance stood stone bulls 16 feet long, 16 feet high, each weighing around 40 tons. Not decoration, theology in stone. Each one announced to every approaching diplomat, every subject, every foreign delegation, the one who lives here is not human scale. The one who lives here holds authority that ordinary comprehension cannot contain. That is the logic of the Hekal, not a building for religious ceremonies, the residence of the one who defines the terms on which everyone else lives. Israel used the same word and meant infinitely more so. Now press the question the translation keeps you from forming. If ekallu, the great house, the sovereign's residence, was the standard ancient Near Eastern vocabulary for the dwelling of supreme power, why would Israel reach for that word to describe God's dwelling and mean something categorically different from every other culture that used it? When you ask the scholars, the answer is consistent. They didn't mean something categorically different. They meant exactly the same thing and infinitely more. In the ancient Near East, the relationship between the king and the deity was not the arm's length separation that modern secular culture assumes. The temple and the palace were often built as adjacent complexes, sometimes physically connected, because the god was understood to be the true king, and the human king was understood to be the god's earthly steward. The Hekal of the god and the Hekal of the human king king were two expressions of the same sovereignty at different registers. Israel inherited this entire vocabulary, and then Israel did something radical with it. Israel removed the human king from the center and placed YHWH there, unmediated and ultimate. Not YHWH authorizing a human king to reign. YHWH as the king, the one whose Hekal was the primary palace, from which all other Hekals derived their legitimacy, and to which all other Hekals were ultimately accountable. Interestingly, YHWH himself seems in no hurry to have a Hekal. When David proposes to build YHWH a proper house, YHWH's response, through Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 7, is striking. I have not dwelt in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. In all the places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar? YHWH's preferred vocabulary for his own dwelling was bayit, house, tent, tabernacle, the portable, mobile, intimate word. Israel introduced the royal word Hekal, and YHWH's response was essentially, I have been living in a tent on purpose. The point has never been the building. The point has always been the presence. And here is something the standard word study almost always misses. The very first occurrence of Hekal in the Old Testament is not in reference to Solomon's temple. It is in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9. Hannah has come to Shiloh to pray. She is in anguish over her barrenness. Eli the priest is sitting on a seat by the doorpost of the Hekal of Yahweh. There is no Solomon's temple, no permanent stone structure in Jerusalem. What is at Shiloh is the wilderness tabernacle, the portable tent-dwelling Yahweh directed Moses to build, which had traveled with Israel through 40 years of desert wandering and had now been set up semi-permanently at Shiloh for nearly 4 centuries. That tent is called a Hekal. And then again in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 3. The young Samuel is lying down in the Hekal of Yahweh, where the ark was. He hears his name called in the night. He runs to Eli 3 times before Eli understands. Yahweh himself is calling the child. The place where the voice breaks through, where the ark rests, where the lamp burns through the night, that place is the Hekal, not Solomon's stone palace, a tent in Shiloh. The word was never about building materials. It was always about the presence that occupies the structure and the sovereignty that presence represents. Picture Samuel, a child, sleeping inside the Hekal at Shiloh, in the room adjacent to the Ark of the Covenant. He knows what the ark carries, the weight of YHWH's covenant with Israel, the tablets from Sinai, the evidence of the wilderness. He knows he is sleeping in the room where YHWH's sovereign presence is most concentrated on earth. And in the dark of that night, the king speaks to the child. Not to the high priest, not to the political leadership, to Samuel, a boy who hasn't yet learned to recognize the voice. Because the Hekal is not where the powerful come to manage God. It is where YHWH speaks to whoever he chooses. The sovereign sets the protocol, not the occupants. When Solomon builds the permanent Hekal in Jerusalem, 1 Kings chapter 6 devotes extraordinary space to the details. 7 years of construction. Not a single hammer blow struck on site. Every stone cut at the quarry and transported already shaped. The building arrived in silence. Cedar from Lebanon covering every interior surface. Gold overlay on every wall, floor, ceiling, altar. Carved cherubim 15 feet high, wings spanning the full width of the inner sanctuary. The bronze pillars at the entrance named Yakin and Boaz. He establishes, and in him is strength. Every surface and every name was a theological argument about the rank and nature of the king whose residence this was. Stand at the threshold of the completed Hekal the day of its dedication. You are a Levitical priest, trained since childhood for this assignment. You know every protocol at the level of muscle memory. The ark has been carried into the inner sanctuary, and then something enters the building that no protocol covers. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10. The cloud fills the Hekal. The kabod, the visible weight-bearing glory that led Israel through the wilderness, fills it so completely that you cannot stand. Not an emotional response, a physical inability to remain upright. The sovereign has arrived at his residence. The great house of the King of everything has received its occupant, and the human participants in the ceremony are simply overwhelmed by the scale of what has moved in. But this is also where Ezekiel becomes essential to understanding what Hekal actually means. Ezekiel chapter 10 describes in precise, step-by-step detail the glory of Yahweh departing the Hekal in Jerusalem, pausing at the threshold, lifting from the threshold to the cherubim in the court, moving to the east gate, hovering there, and finally departing eastward. The building is still standing. The Babylonians have not yet arrived. The Hekal has not been burned or dismantled, but the glory has left. The sovereign has vacated the residence. And what Ezekiel grasps in watching this vision is exactly the logic we have been tracing. The sacred quality was never in the stone. It was always in the presence of the one who dwelt there. When that presence departs, the Hekal becomes, in that moment, simply a very expensive and very empty building.
Here is where intellectual honesty requires something from this study, because word study culture on the internet tends to take a legitimate etymological insight and push it past what the evidence supports. You will find content that takes the palace background of Hekal and concludes the temple was really just a political institution. The sacred quality was a later theological overlay, and once you understand the word's roots, you can stop thinking of it as holy. That is not what the careful scholars say. John Walton of Wheaton College, writing on ancient Near Eastern temple theology, is precise about this. The royal function and the sacred function of the ancient Hekal were not two separate things that were later combined. They were always one thing. You could not have a Hekal that was purely political without a sacred dimension, because the authority of the king was inseparable from the authority of the divine. The sacred and the royal were the same architecture, expressed in the same vocabulary, because they were the same claim about where ultimate sovereignty resides. The honest version of what Hekal reveals is not, stop thinking God's dwelling is sacred. The honest version is this: your English word temple stripped out the sovereignty and kept only the sacredness. And that amputation cost you something you did not know you were missing. You ended up with a God who lives in a designated holy zone, accessible in religious contexts, relevant for spiritual purposes, but whose claim on the rest of your reality is optional. Something you can honor during designated times and bracket everywhere else. That is not the Hekal. The Hekal is the residence of the one who holds authority over everything. The sacredness of the Hekal is the direct consequence of the sovereignty of its occupant. You cannot have one without the other. Now bring all of that to Psalm 27 verse 4 and read it as if you have never read it before. David writes, "One thing I have asked of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his Hekal." Your English Bible says temple, but David is not expressing a wish to attend more services. He is making a declaration about the organizing center of his entire life. Notice what David is not asking for. He is not asking for victory over his enemies, though he has many. He is not asking for safety, though his life is under genuine threat throughout this psalm. He is not asking for provision, for clarity, for justice. He is asking for one thing: to live inside the Hekal of YHWH, to be a permanent member of that particular sovereign's household, not a visitor who shows up for ceremonies, a resident whose daily existence is structured around the rhythms and reality of this particular court, this particular king, this particular governing logic above all others. In a world full of Hekals, Ahab's Hekal in Samaria, the Assyrian ekallu at Nineveh, the palace complex at Babylon, all the competing structures of sovereignty vying for the primary loyalty of every person alive, David names the one he wants to live inside. The translation temple lets you be a devout visitor. You enter on schedule, participate appropriately, and exit back into your life. There is a door you walk through to be in the sacred space, and a door you walk through to return to normal reality. The word Hekal does not give you that door. A palace is not a building you visit. A palace is where you belong or where you don't. You are either a member of the sovereign's household, formed by its logic, subject to its king, sustained by its provisions, or you are an outsider who comes for the ceremony and returns afterward to a different allegiance. David had lived inside rival courts. He had been shaped by Saul's court and then hunted out of it. He had taken refuge with Philistine kings, whose governing logic was entirely alien to everything YHWH had revealed. He was not writing from naive sentiment. He was writing from hard-won clarity. The Hekal you actually live in is the Hekal that is actually making you who you are. And here is where this stops being a historical question and becomes an immediate one, because every person alive lives inside some Hekal. Not metaphorically, structurally. Every life is organized around some center of gravity, some governing logic about where ultimate authority resides and what that authority requires. The logic of achievement, where worth is determined by output and the king's favor goes to whoever performs best. The logic of security, where every decision routes through what minimizes risk risk and protects what you have already built. The logic of belonging, where the real court you are loyal to is the ongoing approval of the people around you. Every one of those is a Hekal. Every one of them is a great house with a sovereign logic at its center, shaping the person who inhabits it day after day into someone formed by that particular logic. The ancient writers understood something the translation temple makes easier to avoid. There is no neutral space. Every life is inside some palace. Every person's deepest defaults about what makes them acceptable and what threatens them, those reveal the Hekal they are actually living in. Not which one they visit, which one they inhabit. David's prayer in Psalm 27 is not about church attendance. It is about architectural allegiance, about which palace's logic is the deep structure of your actual life. Not which palace you quote on social media. Which one is running when the pressure is real, and the question is not what you believe in theory, but what you actually do. If that question landed somewhere real, leave a comment below. Tell me where it hit. Tell me what word in your English Bible you want to open next. Because if temple turned out to contain a full throne room inside it, a complete vocabulary of sovereignty that 70 out of 80 translations quietly replaced with a religious building category, imagine what other words you've been reading with the wrong furniture. And if this kind of study rearranges something rather than just adding information, subscribe. Word by word, we go back to what was actually written, not to undermine the translation you love, because you deserve to read what was actually there. Next time, Shekhinah, the concept the rabbis developed precisely because they understood the logic we have been tracing today. A Hekal without its occupant is just an expensive empty building. Ezekiel watched the glory leave and understood this in real time. The question that matters is not the architecture. The question is whether the king is home, and there is a Hebrew word for what it means when he is, and it does not look anything like what the English word presence has prepared you to expect. The Hekal was never built to be empty, and the word never meant what your translation said it did.